Mexican political culture. Mexican identity is really rooted in a few key characteristics. One being populism and embracing their revolution that gives them a lot of pride and a strong sense of nationalism. It's their fight for independence and other 20th century revolutions that have been led by very charismatic leaders, and they embrace trying to get the support of the popular or the people, or populist movements behind them. So that's one aspect of their political culture. A second aspect of their political culture is because of the charismatic authorities that have been part of revolutions, you see that there is a strong embracing of authoritarianism. Even though Mexico has a democracy, you still see a tradition of authoritarian rule that dates back to Spanish colonialism, and then you can see it today with the one party PRI domination. Catholicism is also a major part of their political identity and part of their socialization. Priests were active during the colonization period, and church and the Catholic Church still remains a major part of the Mexican political culture. The Spanish language, um, there's nearly universal use of Spanish in Mexico. And last thing is the patron clientelism that you see pretty common through the AP6 that we study, but it's very strong with Mexico, where there is a lot of favor trading with the PRI. And as long as the people support the PRI tries to secure favors and money, federal Mexican dollars for certain regions that give strong PRI support. So those are going to be some underlying aspects of the Mexican political culture. Now, moving on to their cleavages. The social cleavages, one major difference, the us versus them division that you have in Mexico, is urban versus rural. Under the PRI, Mexico was mostly rural, and the patron-client system controlled the peasants, and the peasants still will vote for the PRI in return. So what the PRI used to do, or still does, is make sure that federal Mexican money goes to these smaller rural localities. And that's how they keep the rural voter on their side. But thing is that you are seeing more people move into the urban areas of Mexico. So 75% of Mexicans live in an urban environment, which is also, you see, increased literacy rates because now there's higher levels of education. And those people tend to vote for other political parties like PAN, in opposition of the PRI. The PRI really promises people in the country immediate money, but not really true economic development. And what you see is that the people who have moved into the urban areas that have the higher levels of education want to see long-term reform. They want to see, long-term economic development and investment in the country, and not just quick bouts of cash to make the poor feel like they have been taken care of. So it's that whole adage, the PRI is giving people the fish, but the people who support PAN and the opposition parties to the PRI want to learn how to fish. They don't want to be given anything. You also see a north-south divide. The north-south divide really was exacerbated by the signing of the North American Free Trade Agreement. So the North tends to be more prosperous because of its proximity to the United States border. It's more industrialized. You have more middle class there, and there's higher levels of education. So this right here is a map of the GDP of Mexico. The darker green a state is, the more or the higher the GDP that state has. That's Mexico City. So that's why that little dot is dark green. The South is not as developed. There's lower levels of education, and that's going to correspond to lower levels of income as well. And so what you see is people moving from the South to the North. because of these differences. They're moving from the south right here to move to areas where they can get jobs, and there's more economic opportunity. The people who tend to live in the south, and we're going to talk about this more on another slide, are Amerindians, and these are indigenous people. Okay, social class, again, so that is kind of a reinforcing cleavage, or coinciding cleavage, because not only do you have the north versus the south here, but you have the more wealthy versus the poor, the more industrialized versus the more agricultural based or rural areas. Okay. Other social cleavages, it's really going to be ethnic, and it's going to be the difference between the mestizo and the Amerindians. Okay, so about 30% of Mexicans consider themselves Amerindian, and these are indigenous people, people who were in Mexico before Europeans came over and conquered that land. They live in the more marginalized rural areas. Marginalized means they're kind of, if you think about the margins of the paper, they're on the outside or the outskirts of the actual paper. You don't write in the margin, you don't pay attention to the margins. All right, and that's the same thing for marginalized people. They just live on the outskirts. They're not really paid as much attention to. Okay, and because of that, most of Mexico's wealth is actually concentrated in the hands of the mestizos, those of European descent. All right, so here is an ethnic group breakdown chart. Most people are mestizo, and then others identifying with Amerindian indigenous groups. Now, how is this a coinciding cleavage? I'm going to go back to the map. That didn't let me go back to the map. Okay, back to this map. So most of your mestizos live in urban areas. Most mestizos are going to live in the north. And then you have Amerindians that live in the southern region that has higher rates of poverty, and that they don't have the same kind of economic opportunities as those living in the urban areas. The PRI is going to have more influence in these areas, and other opposition parties are going to have more influence in the northern part, where there is higher levels of income and higher levels of education. All right, there one crossover cleavage or cross-cutting cleavage that you get in Mexico is language and religion. So everybody speaks Spanish, and most everybody speaks Spanish, let me correct myself, and most everybody considers themselves Catholic. And that's it for the political culture of Mexico.